Hello everyone. First, I'd like to thank the organisers for the invitation to talk at this National Assembly of the International Motor Development Research Consortium. Second, thank you all for joining me in this virtual talk, which I've entitled A Motor Developmental Approach to Studying Ageing, with a question mark. I was a bit surprised to be asked to talk on ageing, since this has not been my specific research focus, although my work on stroke rehabilitation includes mostly older participants. Nevertheless, this request has made me think about the development of ageing and how we have approached it as a field. Some time ago, Clark and Metcalfe used a mounting range as a metaphor for motor development over time. The idea is that we build and refine motor abilities over the years, largely through practice, deliberate or otherwise, and growth of body systems, becoming truly skillful in probably just a few areas. However, the metaphor has less to say about going down the mountain. Aging is parceled together with injury, disease, disorders, etc. under the term compensation, because both may result in a deterioration or compensation of how we accomplish motor abilities. But to me, studying the recovery of function after stroke is very different from studying ageing, so I will focus on the latter for the remainder of my talk. I will first start with what constitutes a motor developmental study of ageing, then go over two briefly examples of ageing studies that do have a developmental flavour as far as I see it. Then I will discuss a contemporary ageing study on bilateral coordination. And finally, how can future studies of ageing be more developmental and hopefully more impactful and fundable? So let's at first address the elephant in the room. All developmental research ought to be longitudinal. At least that's what a lot of people think. So this quote from a theoretical paper addressing the integration of lifespan and aging says it all. The reality is, of course, there are few longitudinal studies of changing motor performance in older people, even though, if you think about it, the amount of cumulative variation in developmental trajectories and in the constraints surrounding these trajectories as we age imply that it is even more important for longitudinal designs to be implemented. Be that as it may, there are other ways to make a study on older adults' motor development at least quasi-developmental. So what makes a motor developmental study? Well, one definition of motor development is the changes in motor behaviour over the lifespan and the processes that underlie these changes. Note, I've provided some synonymous terms for the purpose of this talk. So key choices in that definition include what movement form is actually being studied, and importantly, why it is being studied, the timescale of looking at change, and the type of design or method employed, both of which depend on the exact question being asked. And lastly, the underlying constraints that may be antecedent to a change and can certainly promote or delay change. Of course, in ageing research, we are usually looking for constraints that may delay or reverse change, which is opposite to our purpose in other age periods. As important as the choice of movement form is, it is the change over time and the investigation of causes that make a study developmental in nature. So I'm going to shamelessly situate the three examples of ageing research that I will present within different research approaches that we have described in two recent papers. So here are the three different approaches. The older studies include activities of daily living as their movement form of choice, and the most recent one is a laboratory task that mimics an activity of daily living. So the first study, or more accurately, set of studies, addressed how individuals get off the floor across the lifespan. These are studies by Anne Van Sant. The purpose, or what I would like to think of as the eventual impact of the research, is to use this information in a therapeutic setting. As an aside, Van Sant also studied sit-to-stand and getting out of bed in the older population. So what method did she use? Well, she had about 5 cross-sectional studies with young children of different ages, adolescents, young adults, and older adults of different ages. They were all filmed, and the instruction was the same for all of them, to rise as quickly and safely as possible. Qualitative biomechanics were utilized according to the Wisconsin method, where she trained, meaning that components of the body were studied independently. Some effort was made to measure constraints, as shown here, but little effort to model these constraints was made by Van Sant. So what did she find? Well, briefly, they found a rich progression of biomechanical efficiency from younger children who used an asymmetrical pattern of rising initially, to adolescents and young adults who, when they were skillful enough, used a symmetrical pattern, and then through to older adults who returned to an asymmetrical pattern. Now, notably, the upper extremity axial and lower extremity components, as Van Sant calls them, all had independent rates of progression or regression, as hypothesized. But most interesting to us here, the older adults did not regress through the exact same developmental levels as the children, demonstrated when they were acquiring developmental levels. This speaks to the importance of studying the regression and looking at these older adults as they start to deteriorate. Sounds awful, doesn't it? So what makes this study developmental? Well, the series of studies are developmental because they study the same task over all age ranges. Therapists can now evaluate where a person is in terms of biomechanical efficiency for this particular task. According to Van Sant, the body of work could be the first lifespan model of movement pattern development of any task. Even though the progression was not studied longitudinally or not verified or validated longitudinally, techniques were used to aid verification of the sequence, and I have referenced a good paper on this. However, as stated earlier, the potential influential constraints, were not specifically modeled or manipulated. And notably, a few other researchers have used this kind of lifespan approach of studying the same task. For example, Marjorie Woolacott studied response to balance perturbations across the lifespan. The second study was by Konzak and his colleagues, and they addressed the match between perceiving and actually climbing up a step. The purpose was both to investigate whether older adults are able to judge their climbing abilities and to determine whether key developmentally changing constraints improved that judgment, indicating potential therapeutic targets. So they had young adults and older adults who viewed an array of riser heights and were asked to decide the highest step they could climb before they used hands and knees. So how high can you climb without resorting to hands and knees? The constraints that they looked at were leg length, which is what Warren had originally based his model on, and they varied this by having both tall and short adults. They also looked at hip flexibility and quadriceps extensor strength. So hip flexibility needed for the first step-on phase to get onto the riser, and extensor quadriceps strength necessary for the pull-up, as seen in this figure taken from Konzak's paper. I must say that looking at this angle here, I'm pretty sure I couldn't have got up that step. So the findings are just to summarize, not surprisingly, older adults could not climb as high as younger adults, but they did maintain the ability to perceive the affordance of their riser height. Indeed, they made fewer mistakes in their initial assessment than the younger adults, and Konczak suggests it's possibly because they are more cautious. But the key thing is that the taller and shorter older adults, not younger, had different or divergent action boundaries when they used the single scale leg length model. But the model using flexibility and strength measures provided a much better fit. So what makes this study developmental? To me, it links 3 body constraints directly to the performance of a perceptual action task and illustrates the greater relative importance of 2 of the constraints in older adults. This could be crucial for maintaining the ability to climb steps, for example, getting in a car. The last study I will present comes from our lab. We've always been interested in bilateral coordination, and bilateral activities are in fact the most common activities for older adults. As a preface, this slide comes from a narrative review paper where we defined 5 forms of bilateral arm coordination. They're divided into symmetric and non-symmetric forms. Symmetric is where each arm performs the same activity, and you can have in-phase, anti-phase, and complex phasing. And non-symmetric is where each arm performs a different activity, which might be complementary, or it could be completely independent. So complementary is where the arms act together to perform a particular task, like eating or cutting bread or opening a jar and that sort of thing. So in adults, most motor behavior experiments have investigated symmetric forms, but we wanted to look at complementary activities since these are common in older adults and appear to be related to functional problems as well as dementia. So what is this picture in here for? I want you to notice that all the individuals are using their right hand to hold the umbrella. Well, they're probably right-handed, you say. So my question is, how do we know the right hand is better adapted to stabilizing against the forces they will receive from their running activity and potentially from the rain and the wind? Do we know that? So there's a hypothesis put forward by Steinberg several years ago. It's called the dynamic dominance hypothesis. And he suggests that the dominant arm is optimized to predict arm trajectory, but the non-dominant arm is also optimized, and that is to stabilize location and be less compliant against forces. So he's arguing against the idea that our dominant hand or arm is best for all activities. Steinberg based his hypothesis on unilateral experiments, and earlier we had extended the hypothesis to younger adults in a virtual bilateral task. So in this study, our purpose was to examine whether the arms were still lateralized and examine the hypothesis that older adults will become less lateralized, which has been demonstrated by others in several tasks. So we had strongly right-handed participants with equal numbers of male and female. Here is representation of the task. This is a Kinnereach, and the participant is unable to see their arms, but they can see the targets, and they can put their arms in these air sleds, so the movement is very smooth. It's like playing air hockey in a sense, so no effect of gravity. And here you can see that in between the 2 hands there is a spring. So this is where the arms have to cooperate because there's a spring between them. And then In here, the spring is represented by the wavy line. When the experimenter says go, the hand are brought both into, or the fingers really, are brought into the green home target, and then immediately a red target will appear, and one of the hands moves as quickly and as accurately as possible to get inside the red target, while the other hand is stabilizing against the force of the spring. So there are many targets in a semicircle around, and there are many trials, but half of each group does left hand stable and right hand moving to the target, and then right hand stable and left hand moving, and then the other half of each group does the reverse order. So for potential constraints or in relationships with what we find, we looked at grip strength, the Badoo pegboard test, and 4 aspects of the test of everyday attention as shown above. So what did we find? On this figure, we have young on the left and old on the right. The x-axis states the position of the targets, medial, center, and lateral. And the y-axis is measuring the deviation from a straight reach. So how accurate is your reaching? The continuous line is the right hand, and the dashed line is the left hand. So what we found were the young were straighter than the old, and as expected, the right hand was straighter than the left. And this happened for both age groups. In the other arm, stabilizing arm, now the y-axis measures how much the stabilizing hand moved, so how well did it stay in the target, in other words. Again, we found an advantage for the young. You can see that they have lower hand displacement, and the old have higher hand displacement. And again, we found the left hand now moved less than the right hand, so it was able to stabilize better. But unexpectedly, we had an interaction effect which demonstrated that the arms were becoming more asymmetrical for the older adults. You can see the gap between the two lines here. So older adults were worse at both tasks, but the dynamic dominance hypothesis held for both tasks, and unexpectedly, for stabilizing, the lateralization was larger, opposite of our expectations. Similar findings occurred in these figures, where the y-axis now reflects compliance, that is, the ability to withstand forces. So if you can withstand forces, you'll have less compliance, not more. The more compliance you have, the more movement you'll make. So now, the elbow and finger both show smaller compliance. In the non-dominant arm, and the finger also shows larger asymmetry for the older adults, as well as more compliance than younger adults. So there were no statistical findings at the shoulder, however. So here are the results again. Joint compliance smaller for non-dominant arm at elbow and finger, and larger interlimb asymmetry for older adults at the finger. So these results went together very nicely with the ones on the previous slide. So, what makes this study developmental? Well, perhaps not very much. We certainly did not look at complementary bilateral coordination cross-sectionally over the lifespan, and we did not model changing constraints onto the motor performance. Of the constraints that I mentioned we did look at earlier, we found only a relationship between grip strength and the asymmetry of stabilizing, but this was across both groups with no group effect. So we really didn't do very much with our, didn't have any good effects with our constraints. However, what we did find was more support for the dynamic dominance hypothesis despite lower performance, and this is a bit similar to Konczak's finding that underlying, in his case, affordance relationships remained intact. And we also found some unexpected age-related changes across the lifespan that will need to be validated. However, if I were to extend this work myself, I might choose to use a more ecologically valid task. So let's return to the title of the talk. I've given examples of two ways that make a study more than just an age-related cross-sectional comparison of typically quite wide age groups. In the following 3 slides, I'm going to make a few general suggestions of how researchers might construct useful studies on aging movement forms. So earlier I suggested typical movement forms for aging studies, which are listed here on the left. Very few have been studied longitudinally, but for funding purposes, is there a reason to do so? What is the ultimate purpose of studying a particular movement form? So here on the right are some of the reasons that should be considered to tie to any proposal for a developmental study of aging. We tend to think of therapeutic reasons and healthy lifestyle reasons a lot when we try to justify our work, but we also have to think of when we're looking at aging. When we're looking at the aging population, we need to think about what is really meaningful for funding and how can we save governments and state governments and local governments financial burden. So here are some other reasons that we should look for. And these lists are not opposite each other for a reason, they're just 2 separate lists. So right now, I would argue we know most about non-disabled movement aging from cross-sectional studies, and these are often in comparison with a specific population or in comparison with young adults, and this is not the best methodology. So what about methodology? Well, despite my earlier remarks, cross-sectional studies may in fact be useful to determine where a meaningful change appears, allowing one to subsequently focus attention for an in-depth longitudinal study. To avoid a potential waste of time, consider multiple single-subject designs or N of 1 studies. These also provide good pilot data for larger studies. Microgenetic designs that measure variables of interest within short time frames will avoid missing transition points. And hybrid designs, of course, combining cross-sectional and longitudinal methodology, may be appealing to funding authorities since a short time period can produce data over a larger period. Consider too a behavioral level design where participants have the same level of motor ability regardless of age, rather than the reverse. And lastly, consider combining with other research teams to share methodology, and also consider reading up on developmental methodology. I know that sounds a bit prescriptive of me, but I can recommend this oldie but goldie, in addition to more recent sources which you should also look up. So finally, constraints. To adequately assess and measure pertinent constraints that you consider to be important for your movement form, I suggest seeking input from other disciplines. This is so that you can link different levels of analysis with experts in measuring those different types of constraints, and these are people who can aid in constructing logical and testable hypotheses. Large research teams are often very impressive to funding agencies. So to end, I would like to acknowledge the researchers whose work I have presented, from left to right: Anne Van Sant, Jürgen Konsak, Liz Wojtowicz, Kelly Westlake, and Bob Sainberg. I also thank all of my research collaborators, students and faculty, and academic colleagues for discussion on topics related to this talk. The suggestions here do not necessarily reflect their views, of course. Thank you for attending, and please ask questions.